Evelyn Andrews' days blended together like a worn-out patchwork quilt, each square indistinguishable from the last. At 53, her life had settled into a rhythm of predictable solitude. Mornings began with a solitary cup of coffee. Afternoons passed in quiet errands or buried in books, and evenings dissolved into the hum of the television filling the void in her home. The quiet was familiar, almost comforting, but it carried a weight, a quiet ache she never dared to name. The grocery store was part of her routine. Every Wednesday afternoon, Evelyn walked its aisles, her list clutched in one hand, her mind wandering. She took her time, not because she needed to, but because it gave her something to do, a way to stretch the hours. It was during one of these aimless afternoons that she first saw him. He was standing in the produce section, inspecting a head of lettuce with a look of mild confusion. His tousled brown hair caught the fluorescent light, and his face, unshaven but not scruffy, carried a youthful charm that was hard to ignore. Evelyn, drawn in by his expression of quiet determination, found herself smiling before she could stop. "Is it supposed to look this sad?" he asked aloud, as though to no one in particular. His voice was warm, edged with humor, and Evelyn realized he was looking at her. Caught off guard, she glanced at the lettuce in his hands and said, "Well, if it's wilting before you've even bought it, I'd say it's not worth the trouble." He laughed, a sound that was as unassuming as it was genuine. "Noted. Clearly, I'm in need of a produce consultant." She wasn't sure why she stayed, why she didn't just offer a polite laugh and move along. But something about him, the easy way he spoke, the light in his hazel eyes, kept her rooted. "Lucky for you, I'm free on Wednesdays." The joke came out before she could second-guess herself, and for a moment, she wondered if she'd overstepped. But his smile only widened. "Good to know. I'm Ryan, by the way." "Evelyn," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Shaking his hand, she was struck by the warmth of his grip, the firm yet gentle hold that lingered just a second longer than she expected. Their conversation was brief, an exchange of pleasantries, a passing comment about the outrageous price of avocados, but it left an impression. As Evelyn watched him walk away, a quiet spark flickered in the corner of her heart, breaking through the monotony she had grown accustomed to. It was silly, really, how much one encounter could shift her mood. But as she pushed her cart toward the checkout line, she found herself smiling, a rare, genuine smile that reached her eyes. For the first time in years, something felt different. The world didn't seem quite so dull, quite so predictable. Evelyn didn't know it then, but that moment in the grocery store was the beginning of something she hadn't dared to hope for. A connection that would change her life. Evelyn didn't expect to see Ryan again, but fate had other plans. The following Wednesday, as she lingered in the bakery aisle debating whether she deserved the indulgence of a lemon tart, she heard that unmistakable voice. "Lemon tarts are a solid choice," he said, appearing beside her as though he belonged there. His easy grin brought an unbidden warmth to her cheeks. "Don't tell me you're a regular in the bakery aisle too," she quipped, trying to hide her surprise. "Guilty," he admitted, holding up a box of chocolate croissants. "You can't beat the classics." They chatted again, this time lingering longer. Ryan asked for advice on picking fresh produce, joking that his bachelor fridge was a wasteland of takeout containers and questionable leftovers. Evelyn found herself laughing more in those few minutes than she had all week. Before they parted, he thanked her with an exaggerated bow, calling her his grocery guru. The title made her laugh, a sound that stayed with her long after he left. After that, their meetings became regular, almost as if unspoken agreements tied their grocery trips to the same day and time. Each week, Evelyn learned a little more about Ryan. He was in his early 30s, worked as a graphic designer, and had a natural curiosity about the world. He listened intently when she spoke, asking thoughtful questions that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't for years. In turn, she found herself sharing parts of her life she had long kept hidden. She spoke of her love for books, her knack for gardening, and her late husband Tom, whose memory lingered like the shadow of a comforting embrace. Ryan listened without pity or discomfort, only quiet understanding. One day, he spotted her struggling to reach a jar on a high shelf and, without hesitation, reached up to grab it for her. "Do I get points for chivalry?" he asked, placing the jar in her cart. "Only if you don't mention my height again," she teased, and they both laughed. It was in moments like these, small, simple exchanges, that their friendship deepened. Evelyn found herself looking forward to their weekly encounters. The way his presence seemed to light up the otherwise mundane chore of grocery shopping. But it wasn't just his humor or charm that captivated her. It was the way he treated her like an equal, like someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered. She realized how much she had missed that, the sense of being truly seen. One afternoon, as they walked toward the parking lot together, Ryan stopped abruptly and said, "You know, Evelyn, these little chats of ours are the highlight of my week." Her breath caught for a moment, and she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "I could say the same." As she watched him drive away, the echo of his words stayed with her. A part of her dared to wonder if these meetings were becoming more than just coincidence, if perhaps they were as meaningful to him as they were to her. For the first time in years, her quiet, predictable life felt like it was opening up to something new, something unexpected. It was a quiet Sunday morning when the realization struck Evelyn like a thunderclap. She was sitting on her porch, sipping her coffee, when she found herself replaying every conversation, every smile, and every lingering glance she had shared with Ryan. Her chest tightened as a flood of emotion surfaced, feelings she hadn't dared to name before. Was this what it felt like to long for someone? Evelyn set her coffee down, her hands trembling slightly. The idea was absurd, wasn't it? She was 53, a widow, a woman with laugh lines and an aching back after gardening too long. He was barely 30, with a world of possibilities stretching out before him. Yet, as much as she tried to rationalize her way out of it, the truth was undeniable. She had feelings for Ryan. The weight of that realization was both thrilling and terrifying. She couldn't remember the last time her heart had raced this way, the last time someone's presence had filled her thoughts so completely. But with that excitement came an undercurrent of fear. What would he think if he knew? Would he be kind, understanding? Or would he retreat, leaving her to carry the awkwardness alone? And what would the world think? She could already hear the whispers, the judgmental stares. What does a woman her age think she's doing? Evelyn shook her head, trying to banish the spiral of doubt. This was foolish, wasn't it? Surely whatever spark she felt was one-sided. Ryan was kind to everyone, that was just who he was. But then she thought of the way his eyes lingered on her when she spoke, the warmth in his voice when he said her name, the way he always seemed genuinely happy to see her, as though she mattered in ways she hadn't felt she did in years. "Stop it," she murmured aloud, scolding herself for letting her imagination run wild. But even as she tried to dismiss it, the feeling remained, stubborn and unyielding. Later that week, when they ran into each other at the grocery store again, Evelyn found herself more guarded, more hesitant. She noticed the little things more. The crinkle of his eyes when he smiled, the way he leaned closer when she spoke. And she felt her own heart betray her with its quickened rhythm. As they parted ways that day, Ryan paused, his hand lingering on the handle of his cart. "Hey, Evelyn," he said softly, almost shyly. "Would you ever want to grab coffee sometime? Outside of our produce aisle meetings?" Her breath caught. For a moment, she didn't trust her voice, didn't trust herself to respond without betraying the whirlwind inside her. But she managed a smile, calm and steady, even as her heart pounded. "I'd like that," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she felt. As she watched him walk away, Evelyn clutched her cart, grounding herself against the flood of emotions. There was no denying it now. What she felt for Ryan was real, and no amount of logic or denial could erase it. The question that remained was, what would she do with it? Evelyn spent the days leading up to their coffee meeting in a fog of conflicting emotions. Excitement and trepidation warred within her, each vying for dominance as she imagined what the outing could mean. It wasn't a date, of course it wasn't, but the significance of stepping beyond the grocery store filled her with equal parts hope and dread. She found herself staring into the bathroom mirror more often than usual, scrutinizing the lines around her eyes and the silver streaks in her hair. She adjusted her lipstick twice before finally wiping it off altogether, her inner voice scolding her for caring so much. "He's just being nice," she told herself, but that nagging voice of doubt refused to quiet. When the day arrived, Evelyn almost canceled. She hovered over her phone, her thumb poised to type out an excuse. "Sorry, something came up. Let's reschedule." But she couldn't bring herself to send the message. Something deep inside her wanted to see where this would go, even if it was just a friendly coffee with a kind young man. At the cafe, Ryan was already waiting, sitting at a corner table with 2 steaming mugs. He waved when he saw her, his smile as warm as ever. "Evelyn," he said, standing as she approached. "You look great." She felt a flush creep up her neck and mentally chastised herself for being so easily flustered. "Thank you," she replied, settling into the seat across from him. "This is a nice spot." They fell into easy conversation, much like they did in the grocery aisles, but this time there was something different. Without the distraction of carts and shelves, Evelyn noticed the way he leaned forward when she spoke, the way his gaze seemed to hold hers a second longer than necessary. She shared stories from her younger years, traveling with her late husband, raising her daughter, and the unexpected twists life had thrown her way. Ryan listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that made her feel both seen and valued. In turn, he shared snippets of his own life, his aspirations, his love for art, and the ways he was still figuring out who he wanted to be. As the hours slipped by, Evelyn found herself both drawn to and overwhelmed by the connection between them. It felt easy, natural, as though they had known each other far longer than they actually had. But beneath the surface, doubt gnawed at her. Was she misreading the situation? Was this just a young man being kind to a woman who had spent so long feeling invisible? As they left the cafe, Ryan walked her to her car, hands tucked into his pockets. "I'm really glad we did this," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Me too," she replied, the words catching in her throat. For a moment, there was silence, a pause that seemed to stretch into eternity. Evelyn felt the weight of the unspoken lingering between them, an energy she couldn't quite name but that filled her with both exhilaration and fear. "Drive safe," he said, finally breaking the spell. Evelyn nodded, slipping into her car and gripping the wheel tightly. As she drove away, her thoughts raced. What had she just experienced? Was it a friendship blooming into something more? Or was it simply her own heart daring to hope for something impossible? For the rest of the evening, Evelyn sat by her window, staring out at the darkened sky. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life was changing, but the question loomed large. Was she brave enough to embrace it? The days after the coffee meeting were a blur. Evelyn found herself going over every moment in her head, replaying their conversation, each smile and every shared laugh. But something else lingered in her thoughts, a thought that grew stronger as the days passed. Maybe I should invite him over. It wasn't something she'd normally consider. Her house was tidy, but it wasn't what she would call a place for guests. There were the half-filled photo albums from when her daughter was young, the old china collection that had sat untouched for years. And yet, the idea of inviting Ryan into her world, into her home, felt like something more than just a casual gesture. It felt like a step, a deeper connection, a crossing of some invisible line that had kept her in the quiet, solitary world she'd inhabited for so long. What if he says no? The thought nagged at her, but she pushed it away. The next morning, Evelyn found herself at the kitchen counter, tapping her fingers nervously as she looked at the flowers on the counter. She bought them the day before, on a whim, as though some unseen force was guiding her actions. The vibrant blooms sat in a glass vase, reminding her of the colors she hadn't allowed herself to appreciate in years. She wanted to share them with someone who could see them the way she did. He's just a friend, she reminded herself. But maybe he could be more than that. The phone in her hand felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just about asking someone over. It was about exposing a piece of herself that had remained hidden for so long. Evelyn could feel the weight of that vulnerability, the fear of rejection mingling with the excitement of possibility. Finally, with a deep breath, she dialed his number. Her heart pounded in her chest as the line rang. "Hello." Ryan's voice came through, light and casual, but there was something in it that made her pulse race. "Hi, Ryan," she said, her voice steady, despite the flutter in her stomach. "It's Evelyn. I was wondering if you'd like to come over sometime. I've been thinking about making dinner, nothing fancy. Just an evening of good food and conversation." There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment, she thought she'd misjudged the whole thing. Maybe it was too soon, too forward. But then, Ryan's voice broke the silence, warm and sincere. "I'd love that, Evelyn. What time should I come?" A wave of relief washed over her, followed by an overwhelming sense of something else. Something she couldn't quite name, but that felt like a door opening, inviting her to step into the unknown. 6 o'clock sound good? She asked, her words sounding steadier than she felt. Perfect, Ryan replied. I'll see you then. When she hung up, Evelyn stood in the middle of the kitchen, her heart beating loudly in her chest. There was no going back now. She had invited him into her world, into the space where she had lived in isolation for so long. But something told her that this wasn't just a casual dinner. It was a moment that could change everything. As the day wore on, she found herself preparing in ways she hadn't in years. She made sure the table was set just so, adding a few candles to make the atmosphere feel warm and inviting. She carefully chose a bottle of wine she'd been saving for a special occasion. She didn't know what would happen tonight, but she wanted it to be perfect. Evelyn stood back and surveyed the room, her reflection in the window looking back at her. She had spent so long hiding from her own desires, burying the things she wanted for fear of what others might think. But now, in the quiet of her home, she felt a spark of something new, something that made her feel alive. She could hear the sound of a car pulling up outside, and her pulse quickened. This was it. When Ryan arrived, Evelyn was in the kitchen, her hands busy arranging the plates on the table, but her heart was racing with anticipation. She heard his knock before she even had time to compose herself. The doorbell echoed through the quiet of her home, and as she opened it, she was met with his familiar warm smile. He stood there, holding a bottle of wine in one hand, a small bouquet of flowers in the other. I brought these, he said softly, his eyes gleaming with a hint of tenderness. For the hostess with the mostess. Evelyn couldn't help but smile, a small flush creeping up her neck. Thank you, she said, taking the flowers and stepping aside to let him in. His presence in her home felt like a delicate intrusion, not unwelcome but new, unsettling almost. It was a place that had belonged solely to her for so long. And now, it was filled with his energy, his youthful vibrancy, which contrasted so sharply with the quiet, muted rhythm of her life. Please make yourself at home, she said, leading him into the dining area. Dinner's almost ready. They settled at the table, the flickering light from the candles casting a soft glow on their faces. They laughed and chatted, the conversation flowing effortlessly, much like it had in the cafe. There was an ease between them, a familiarity that felt like it had existed all along, and yet everything about this evening felt charged with new possibilities. As they ate, Evelyn found herself watching him more closely than usual, his hands as he gestured, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She could feel her heart stirring with something that went beyond the platonic affection she had convinced herself this was. There was something undeniable in the way he made her feel, something both thrilling and terrifying. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to hold still. Her breath caught, and the world outside her home felt distant, muted. It was just the two of them, no age, no expectations, no boundaries. I'm glad you invited me over, Ryan said, his voice low, sincere. I've really enjoyed getting to know you, Evelyn. Her chest tightened at his words, a rush of warmth spreading through her. I'm glad you came, she replied, her voice a little shakier than she intended. This is nice. It feels, she paused, searching for the right word. It feels like something I haven't had in a long time. Ryan's gaze softened. You deserve this kind of connection, he said, his eyes locking with hers. More than you realize. For a brief moment, Evelyn was flooded with a strange mix of vulnerability and hope. The line between friendship and something more was starting to blur, and she didn't know how to navigate it. She wanted to reach across the table, to feel the warmth of his hand in hers, but fear held her back. Fear of being vulnerable, of being judged, not just by him, but by the world around them. And yet, in the silence that followed, Evelyn could no longer ignore the pull she felt towards him. Her heart was a delicate, fragile thing, but it had begun to open in a way it hadn't in years. Without thinking, she stood up and walked around the table, her steps tentative but sure. Ryan watched her with a quiet intensity as she approached him. She could feel the electricity between them, an unspoken understanding, a promise of something new. Evelyn, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Without answering, she reached for his hand, her fingers brushing his. The contact sent a wave of warmth through her, and in that instant she knew. She knew that this connection wasn't just about age or circumstance. It was about two souls finding each other, recognizing something deep and real in the other. Ryan squeezed her hand gently, his thumb caressing the back of it. "Are you sure about this?" Evelyn's heart thudded in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't about being sure, it was about something far more instinctual, more raw. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew that, right now in this moment, she didn't want to let him go. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But I think I want to find out." The tension that had been building between them released in that moment, like the first drop of rain after a long drought. Ryan leaned forward, his lips brushing softly against hers, tentative at first, as if asking for permission. And when she responded, the kiss deepened, slow and tender, filled with a warmth that she had long forgotten was possible. It was a kiss that felt like both a beginning and an end to the loneliness that had marked so many of her years, and a beginning to something she couldn't quite name yet, but that she knew she was ready to explore. As the evening wound down and Ryan left her home, Evelyn sat quietly in the stillness of her living room, the remnants of their dinner lingering on the table untouched. Her thoughts were a swirl of emotions, excitement, confusion, and an undeniable sense of joy. The evening had felt like a dream, a beautiful, uncharted territory she never expected to find herself in. She ran her fingers through her hair, staring at the empty space where Ryan had sat just moments ago. His presence still lingered in the air, a warmth she hadn't felt in years. "What am I doing?" The question hovered in her mind, unspoken yet persistent. Her life had always been carefully controlled, structured by routines, responsibilities, and the steady march of time. She had convinced herself, long ago, that love was a thing of the past, something that belonged to her younger years, something that had faded with the passage of time. She buried the idea of romance deep inside her, where it couldn't cause her pain or disappointment. But now, as she sat alone in the quiet, those walls she built around her heart were beginning to crack. Ryan had shown her something she had long forgotten: possibility. The world she had kept at arm's length suddenly seemed full of new opportunities, new beginnings. And though there was a quiet voice inside her telling her to be cautious, to protect herself from heartbreak, another part of her, a deeper part, yearned to embrace the unknown. But what about the age difference? The question was unavoidable, echoing in her thoughts like an unwanted guest. Evelyn couldn't ignore the reality of their situation. She was in her 50s, experienced, lived, and worn by time in a way that Ryan wasn't. He was young, vibrant, with the whole of his life ahead of him, while she had already seen the better part of hers unfold. What would people say? How would they look at them, this older woman and the younger man? But as she thought about the kiss they had shared, the way his touch had made her feel, Evelyn realized something crucial. Age, in that moment, had felt irrelevant. It had been nothing more than a number, a passing detail in the larger scheme of their connection. Love didn't care about age. It didn't care about expectations or social norms. It only cared about the hearts involved. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the memory of their kiss wash over her. She hadn't felt so alive, so seen in years. And she knew in her heart that the love they shared, whatever it would become, was just as real as any other kind of love. There were no rules. There was only the raw truth of connection, of two people finding something in each other that transcended the boundaries of time. As she allowed herself to sit with the feelings swirling inside her, a quiet resolve began to form. She wasn't going to let fear hold her back. She wasn't going to hide from this or deny it. She had spent so many years locked away in a world of caution, of playing it safe, and it had left her feeling empty. Now, for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was truly living. Evelyn thought about Ryan again. His laughter, his warmth, his touch, everything about him felt like a breath of fresh air, like a promise of something better. Something she hadn't expected, something she hadn't dared to dream. "I'm not too old for this," she whispered to herself, her voice full of quiet determination. "I'm not too old for love." The thought settled in her chest like a comforting embrace, and Evelyn finally allowed herself to smile. A soft, knowing smile that felt like the start of something beautiful. She didn't know where this would lead, or what the future held. But she knew, for the first time in a long while, that love could happen at any age. And maybe, just maybe, The best was yet to come. The weeks that followed were a quiet, joyous revelation. Evelyn allowed herself to explore this new chapter of her life with Ryan, without the burdens of hesitation or fear. They continued to meet, sometimes for coffee, other times for long walks in the park, where their conversations would flow like a river, smooth and constant. It was as though they had always known each other, as though time had folded in on itself. And in those moments, age, experience, and all the societal expectations that would normally weigh heavily on her vanished. What was left was the simplicity of shared moments, of being seen, of being wanted. There were, of course, moments of doubt, times when the world outside their bubble reminded them that their love was not conventional. Evelyn heard the whispers, felt the judgment in the eyes of others, those who couldn't quite grasp what she had with Ryan. But in those moments, when she held his hand, when their eyes met and the world seemed to fall away, Evelyn knew that none of that mattered. What they shared was a truth that no one could take from them. One evening, after a particularly beautiful day together, as they sat side by side on the couch, Evelyn looked at him with a softness in her gaze that spoke volumes. "I used to think love had a time limit," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was something reserved for younger people, for those with their whole lives ahead of them. But I was wrong." Ryan smiled, his hand brushing against hers. "Love has no age," he said, his voice gentle. "It just is. And it's real, Evelyn. This is real." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. It was the truth she had been afraid to acknowledge for so long. The truth that love, in all its forms, was a gift that could come at any time in any place. And it wasn't the age of the people involved that mattered. What mattered was the depth of connection, the shared understanding, and the willingness to love without fear. Evelyn had spent so many years guarding her heart, but now she realized that love was something she could give freely without regret. She had learned that there was no expiration date on the heart's capacity to feel, to grow, and to embrace the joy that came with truly living. "I think," she said, her voice steady now, "that this is the happiest I've ever been." Ryan turned to her, his eyes reflecting the same depth of feeling. "Me too." And as they sat there, side by side, their fingers intertwined, Evelyn felt a sense of peace settle over her. There was no longer any fear of what others might think, no longer any concern about what the future held. She had found something extraordinary, something that didn't follow the rules or adhere to expectations. She had found love, and it was enough. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling his warmth envelop her, and for the first time in years, Evelyn felt that anything was possible. Love, after all, was timeless, and she had learned that it was never too late to start over, to open yourself up, and to follow your heart. "Here's to us," she whispered, and in the silence of the room, with only the soft hum of their shared breath filling the space between them, it felt like the most beautiful promise of all.